Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz has the evening off. Here's what we're looking at. Nearly 5,000 pilots are suspected of falsifying or misreporting their medical records to avoid being grounded. What that means for airline safety.
We share the concerns that you have about the quality of our service.
The CTA touts better bus and rail transit while warning of looming challenges. Where does the case against former House Speaker Michael Madigan stand? And Republicans in Springfield are calling for ethics reform after Madigan's chief of staff is convicted of corruption charges. And now to some of today's top stories. A Chicago firefighter has died from injuries he received responding to a house fire earlier this month. The fire department says Lieutenant Kevin Ward died at Loyola Medical Center after being injured in a house fire in Norwood Park on August 11th. Firefighters paid their respects today with a procession as Ward's remains were taken from the hospital to the medical examiner's office. Fire officials say Ward was 59 years old and joined the department in 1996. Lieutenant Ward is at least the third Chicago firefighter to die in the line of duty this year. Medicare patients with heart disease, diabetes, or certain cancers would be among the first to pay lower prices on medication when the Biden administration's new price negotiation program goes into effect. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services unveiled a list of the first 10 drugs subject to price negotiation with manufacturers, though the drug industry has filed multiple lawsuits to derail the effort. The program is part of the Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats pushed through Congress last year, arguing price negotiations would lower drug costs. The IRA also caps the monthly cost of insulin at $35 for Medicare enrollees, allows seniors to get more vaccines at no charge, and penalizes drug makers that raise prices higher than inflation.
Instead of using all your energy to fight the disease, you're fighting insurance or drug companies for medicines that literally keep you alive. Without them, you're not going to be here.
The negotiated prices would take effect in 2026. Up next, examining airline safety following an alarming report on pilots right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Thousands of U.S. airline pilots may be unfit to fly. Nearly 4,800 pilots, including some 600 licensed to fly passenger airliners, are being investigated by the Federal Aviation Authority for potentially concealing major health issues that could have grounded them, according to a Washington Post report. The pilots are all military veterans and were identified when the FAA cross-checked pilot health information against a Veterans Affairs database of former service members collecting disability benefits. The FAA has also already ordered 60 pilots who, quote, posed a clear danger to aviation safety to stop flying immediately until their records are reviewed. Joining us now to share their thoughts are Hassan Shahidi, president and CEO of the Flight Safety Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates globally on issues of air safety, and Captain Dennis Tager, an American Airlines pilot and spokesman for the Allied Pilots Association. That's a union that represents pilots with American Airlines. Gentlemen, thanks to you both for joining us. First, I want to get your reaction to this report, if I can. Captain Tager, let's start with you, please.
Well, first, these veterans have been, selected out because they're on disability, likely from 2 decades of war that we've had. This does not excuse any mistakes made or misrepresentation in the important reporting, but it actually forces us to take a closer look at why would a pilot possibly choose or mistakenly not disclose something. And therein lies the real core of this and getting to a better place. So the FAA has a lot of structural issues in processing getting a pilot back to flying, waiting 12 to 18 months in many cases. It's more of a documents bureaucracy issue, but I'm sure the doctor can share more of the concern. But the bottom line is we've got to keep fit, healthy pilots on the flight deck to keep our passengers safe. But we have to recognize that needs to be maintained frankly, pilots, when something happens that might take them out of the flight deck, they're not just missing the joy of flight, they're likely putting their family income at risk. And if they don't have a safety net, that can only exacerbate that decision.
And I certainly want to come back to some of that, like why some of this might happen and why what pilots are kind of thinking and some of the issues they have to consider as well. But Hassan Shahidi, I want to get you in on the same question. What's your reaction to this report?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I think it's absolutely important to have accurate medical records on file, and that pilots should provide timely and accurate information. That said, of the 4,800 cases, half of them have been resolved already by the FAA. There have been some discrepancies, and the records are being updated. The rest are being currently investigated, and we'll have to wait and see the result of that investigation. I believe that before all is said and done, the vast majority of those will be resolved. These are discrepancies that happen over time, and they will be resolved and updated. It is absolutely important that moving forward, we find a way to make sure that the information is shared in a timely way, and make sure that those that have been temporarily grounded, their records are addressed and they can get back to flying.
Captain Taser, you mentioned, 2 decades of wars for, pilots who were formerly in the military. Is it unfair or even disrespectful for those pilots to be singled out this way?
Well, I'm a veteran as well, and having served in the Middle East, these are men and women of high honor and integrity. And if the system, the way it's set up, and clearly because of the document access, they were, I'll use the word targeted, but I'm sure it was just because it was the easiest way to get at this and find this discontinuity. So we've got to stand with our vets for what they went through, but it doesn't excuse misrepresenting if that's the case. But as the doctor said, I'm sure this can be resolved. But this FAA, the medical standards for an airline pilot need modernization. And there's a House bill that's been approved for the FAA reauth that actually addresses that and brings the team together, from mental health issues to just getting a pilot back onto the flight deck as quickly, as safely as possible. This is the time to get it done and fund the FAA so they can have all the assets to make this happen. All this during a pilot shortage. It's good that we're looking at this, but we've got to do all that we can to keep that pipeline flowing of fit, healthy pilots.
Dr. Shahidi, should the system of pilot health screening be reconsidered in its current form if it seems to heavily rely on pilots self-reporting a health problem that could in turn get themselves grounded?
Well, I think certainly streamlining is absolutely important, but also the requirement is for the pilot to be fit to fly and for the pilot to report their medical condition. That said, there is absolutely room for improvement. The current questionnaire for the medical records is complicated, and that really needs to be reformed. The FAA is currently looking at that to make sure that the questions that are being asked, and both Captain Taser and I have answered those questions, and some of them are complicated. And so there's a real need for modernization for that record, and we should not jump to a conclusion as to whether these record the confusions are being misrepresented. Sometimes it's just confusing questions. So we have to wait and see and not jump to conclusions, but there's absolutely room for improvement for the system.
Captain, we've got about 30 seconds left. What would the Allied Pilots Association like to see happen next?
This legislation passed, picked up by the Senate, so we can modernize this so that pilots know that there's a logical, not just a safety net, but a process to get them back into the flight deck when they're well. That will lead a pilot to knowing, hey, I've got a place to go. This is the right thing to do, and we won't have any of these either human mistakes or misjudgments.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. Captain Dennis Taser and Dr. Hassan Shahidi, thanks to you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, CTA leaders share updates on their services and what challenges still lie ahead. Stay with us. CTA leaders are marking the anniversary of a strategic plan aimed at boosting diminished service and staffing levels. The agency says on average, it ran far more scheduled buses and trains last month than it did in August of 2022. But some passengers and advocates are still calling on the transit agency to do more for commuters, and regional leaders are taking a hard look at how to provide sustainable public transportation across the Chicago area. Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg was at today's CTA board meeting and joins us now. Nick.
Well, Brandis, the CTA struggles have been a pretty constant topic of conversation in the city over the past few years. Everything from crime and cleanliness to ghost buses and staffing shortages. Last August, the agency unveiled a plan called Meeting the Moment, aimed at turning the transit service around. To mark the plan's one-year anniversary, the agency's been touting gains in service, staffing levels, and more. The CTA says last month it delivered an average of 88% of scheduled rail service compared to 71% in August of last year. And it says it delivered 96% of bus service in July compared to just 81% last August. But CTA President Dorval Carter acknowledged the frustrations many commuters still have and says the agency is doing the best it can despite a tough environment for transit systems around the country.
We certainly, in spite of those issues, will continue to work every day to improve on what we're doing right now. I recognize that not everyone has a positive experience riding CTA on a regular basis.
Some transit advocates say there's still more to be done. Part of the strategic plan involved changing bus and train schedules to match staffing levels, which Carter was adamant weren't cuts. Brandon McFadden is with the group Commuters Take Action.
We find that they're running the right number of trains on most of the lines, mostly every day. It definitely fluctuates from day to day, but they're running at really inconsistent intervals now. So you'll see, trains that'll run back to back and then a really long gap in between them that may not necessarily be caught in the metrics the way they're measuring them.
And McFadden says the agency's reliability metrics just don't always capture those long gaps based on the way they measure things, which is an issue.
Nick, you mentioned the staffing shortfall. Where do things stand there?
Yeah, Carter has said for a long time that a huge reason behind long waits and inconsistent service is, no surprise, that the agency just hasn't had enough bus and train operators. Now today, he says the CTA's held more than 10 job fairs in the last year with nearly 3,000 attendees. It's put together new hiring and retention incentives. Carter calls it their most aggressive recruitment program ever.
The CTA has already hired more employees in 2023 than in any previous recent year, including 600 newly hired bus operators, which is as many bus operators as we have historically hired in a 12-month period.
Brandon McFadden says despite that recruitment, his group sees CTA staffing numbers that are still relatively flat and is hoping for more transparency.
They're showing, oh, we're losing this many to transfers or retirements or just plain separations. But we aren't really seeing why the numbers aren't growing, whether it's, not enough qualified candidates or we're not trying hard enough to get qualified candidates.
Today's meeting also had a presentation from regional planning agency CMAP on creating stronger and more stable transit across Chicagoland. They won't make any final recommendations to state lawmakers until later this year, but they're looking at everything from infrastructure to funding models to increased coordination or even some sort of merger among CTA, Metra, and PACE. CMAP and CTA leaders say all those improvements cost money, and of course, Brandis, that means they will need support in Springfield.
Don't they always? Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Up next, he was arguably the state's most powerful politician. Where the case against Michael Madigan stands. But first, a look at the weather. Former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan is preparing for a federal jury to decide whether he ran a criminal enterprise as the state's most powerful politician. This as he faces a team of prosecutors emboldened by a perfect record of convictions in 2 trials. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more on what we might expect for the politician once known as the Velvet Hammer. Heather, remind us what Madigan is charged with.
He faces 23 counts that essentially allege he ran a racketeering operation as Speaker of the Illinois House, that he used his official power to enrich his friends and funnel business to his property tax law firm. He will stand trial alongside Michael McLean, one of his closest confidants, dating to the 1970s when the two served together in the Illinois House, and that trial is scheduled for April.
So what did we learn, though, from these across-the-board guilty verdicts in the so-called ComEd 4 trial, as well as the case against Madigan's former Chief of Staff, Tim Mapes?
Well, the same team of prosecutors that will face Madigan in April convinced two different federal juries that the people surrounding Madigan were engaged in criminal activity. And I've begun thinking about those trials as sort of the opening act, with Madigan's trial as the headliner. Now they will have to take what they learned in those two trials and tell a slightly different story, that all of those criminal actions were the benefit and orchestrated by one man, Michael Madigan, with the help of Michael McLean.
Give us a sense of what Madigan's defense will be.
So he is still asking the judge in his case to toss out hours and hours of wiretaps and recorded conversations saying that they were illegally obtained. If that doesn't succeed, he is likely to argue to a jury that he did nothing criminally wrong. He was just engaged in lobbying and politics, and while it might not be pretty, it's not illegal. The problem facing Madigan is that the so-called ComEd 4, of which Michael McLean was one, tried a very similar argument in their trial, and the jury did not buy it.
So you're in court this afternoon for a hearing in the case against Madigan and Mike McLean, who, as you said, has already been convicted in a related case. What did we learn today?
That the judge in the case, Robert Blakely, wants no more delays, that it is going to trial in April, and that the prosecutors and the defense attorneys have to be ready for that. So if he goes to trial in April, Madigan will have lapsed 2 years between indictment and trial, which is extremely long, caused in part by COVID-19 shutdowns and just the massive amount of evidence in this case and how difficult a 23-count indictment is to try.
Okay, attorneys will have to be ready, so will reporters. Heather Sharon
Yes,
on the
indeed.
case for us. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. And up next, we speak with Illinois lawmakers about legislative ethics reforms that could stem from these recent convictions. Stay with us. And as we just heard, former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan is facing corruption charges, along with his close friend, confidant, and former lawmaker turned lobbyist, Mike McLean. So in the wake of the sweeping convictions of Madigan's Chief of Staff, Tim Mapes, and the so-called ComEd 4, what possible legislative ethics reforms could result? Joining us to talk about that are State Senator John Curran, the Illinois Senate Republican leader, and State Representative Tony McCombie, the Illinois House Republican leader. We also invited Democratic members of the Illinois House and Senate, but they declined. Governor J.B. Pritzker's spokesperson did send a statement which reads in part, quote, "Since taking office, Governor Pritzker has advanced the cause of ethics reform in key areas, especially in bringing more transparency to the process and tightening requirements for lobbyists. The governor believes we must restore the public's trust in government, and he will continue to work with the General Assembly to ensure that those who violate that trust are held accountable." Meanwhile, Senator Curran and Representative McCombie, we thank the both of you for joining us. Senator Curran, let's start with you, please. In light of the Tim Mapes and ComEd 4 convictions, what is the #1 ethics reform that you'd like to see?
You know, Brandis, I've been proposing in the Senate for quite a while now, expanding RICO wiretapping authority to our local prosecutors throughout this state. Same tools that the federal government, the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office uses in these types of investigations, resulting in the conviction of the former executive director of the Illinois Democratic Party in this case, as well as expanding the statewide grand jury that the Attorney General of the state uses to investigate public corruption crimes. They already have impaneled a statewide grand jury. However, it's limited and it does not allow the Attorney General to investigate public corruption crimes. I think those are two reforms that make a lot of sense. They've been around for a while, and it's past time for the General Assembly to move forward on those.
Representative McCombie, tell us about your ethics bill, which would ban the use of campaign funds to pay for criminal defense attorneys.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it. Yeah, this is a bill that has been proposed before, and this is just one of many. I think we could do some additional on a revolving door for legislators to be lobbyists as well. But this one here is we receive campaign funds from our donors to get us elected or reelected, and to be able to use those campaign dollars as Speaker Mike Madigan has used $8.5 million of campaign donations in his fund to in his court cases here, just seems really unethical and disingenuous to his donors. So this bill would change that, and I think is a pretty common sense bill to bring forward.
Senator Curran, Democrats say that they have enacted ethics reform in the wake of the ComEd scandal, including requiring lawmakers to list immediate family members employed by a public utility. Do you think that goes far enough?
Brandon, it does not go far enough. I mean, there have been some steps on transparency and disclosures that the General Assembly has taken, but we continue to under-resource and understaff the law enforcement end of it that actually investigates these types of crimes. Leaving it all to the U.S. Attorney's Office, who are limited in resources, acts as really a strain or a tight filter on actually investigating, rooting out all of the activity that we want to remove from the legislative process and just from government in general.
Representative McCombie, talk about the so-called revolving door where lawmakers leave office and then they become lobbyists. How big of a problem is that?
Well, it's a pretty big problem. We would like to see it be a 3-year. It's kind of interesting, and I thought this was a ridiculous thing that could happen, but it's amazing to me to think that I could be a mayor of a community, a state representative, and a lobbyist all at the same time. So it certainly is a problem, and it's not appropriate. So there's also a case where a representative or a senator was charged and convicted, and then can turn around and come back and then be a lobbyist in the state house, and that's also an issue that I think we should be banning in the General Assembly.
Senator Curran, what would giving the legislative inspector general subpoena power versus a criminal probe, what would that do?
Brandon, that's another filter, artificial filter that we put on the process. The legislative inspector general must get authority right now under the statute to issue a subpoena from the Ethics Commission, the Oversight Commission. We want the inspector general or legislative inspector general to actually act with autonomy and investigate and root out any sort of corrupt practices, and that it certainly should be inherent powers within that office to issue those subpoenas, gather the facts, and then put those in front of the Ethics Commission, not be constrained from even investigating the allegations that are brought to the legislative inspector general.
Representative McCombie, the Democrats, as we mentioned earlier, they say they did pass some ethics reform in the spring session. Did you vote for them, and is that better than nothing?
Well, we are always going to support ethics reform, and just to pass a little bit, they say that's comprehensive. There was passing some reform on our economic statements for our disclosures, and of course, anything is better than nothing. But when you're not punishing bad behavior or really being strong on it, you're just being political, so they can say they've done comprehensive. We really need to be tackling this. And at the end of the session, they said, you know, we need some time. We're going to be calling for some summer sessions, and we're gonna really be tackling this summer. But there hasn't been any meetings tackling this summer, so that's a problem. And they say, well, we run out of time in the session. We're busy during the session, and that's where Leader Spain last week called for the governor to call for a special session. If we don't have any time, let's have a special session, and let's just really hammer this out. This isn't a Republican issue. This isn't a Democrat issue. It's just an issue we need to address.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to State Representative Tony McCombie and State Senator John Curran for joining us.
Thank you.
Brandon.
And that is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. You can also get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. The political fight over work authorization for migrants. Our Spotlight Politics team on that and more. Plus, we fly to O'Hare Airport for a tribute honoring veterans. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.